For 7 decades, David Thorne held the conviction that his sibling had succumbed in a medical institution until his canine companion, Gunnar, unearthed a railway track absent from any cartography. Venturing along this concealed route into the nebulous expanse, they did not encounter a sanctuary. Instead, they discovered a derelict freight car laden with unoccupied wheelchairs and a stone citadel, safeguarding a journal that would unveil a crime spanning generations. Official archives asserted the children's rescue, yet the forest narrated a chillingly divergent account. Kindly endorse our endeavor by subscribing as we unravel the enigma of Misty Valley. The flames within the stone hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, suffusing the worn rug with a profound, oscillating saffron radiance. David Thorne occupied his leather recliner, a steadfast presence in this chamber, as long as the dwelling had endured. The stillness of the aged abode typically offered solace, a gentle shroud against the clamor of the external world. However, on this particular eve, it felt oppressive, intensifying the pressure within his auditory canals. In his unfeeling grasp, David cradled a solitary sheet of parchment. It was composed of cream-toned linen, once a luxury, now aged to a yellowed fragility at its edges. So delicate he feared his roughened fingertips might inadvertently tear it. The penmanship was recognizable, albeit more tremulous than he recollected from his youth. It was his mother, Martha's hand, inscribed during her final weeks prior to her demise. Secreted within a wooden memento box, she had made him pledge not to unseal until her passing. He had interred her merely 3 days prior. This evening, he had finally opened the coffer. He reread the passage for what felt like the 20th time since dusk had fallen. The words constituted a confession, a release of a burden that had accumulated throughout a lifetime. She recounted an encumbrance she could no longer bear into the hereafter. "My dearest David," she had written, "forgive me for bequeathing you this shadow. For 70 years I have permitted you to harbor a falsehood, as the truth was too dreadful for me to articulate. Your brother Michael did not perish in the hospital in the city. May God forgive me. I allowed them to take him." David's respiration faltered. He averted his gaze from the document, fixing his stare upon the dying embers. Michael, the name was spectral within this house, seldom uttered, yet perpetually manifest. David was merely 5 years old in 1955. His recollections of that period were akin to fragmented shards of sea glass, smoothed and indistinct. He recalled the palpable tension within the domicile, the hushed exchanges between his parents concerning the inundations and the evacuation directives. But most vividly, he remembered a sound. Michael was 7, 2 years his senior, but polio had inflicted grievous damage upon his legs, rendering them withered and immobile. To ambulate, he relied on heavy steel braces secured with thick leather straps. David closed his eyes, and the sound surged back from the depths of his recollection. It was a metronomic, mechanical cadence, the sharp impact of metal against the hardwood flooring, followed by the softer scrape of a shoe. Then the impact recurred. Clank, drag, clank, drag. It was the auditory backdrop to Michael's existence. He returned to the letter. Martha described the pandemonium of that autumn in 1955. The valley was succumbing to the rising waters, and panic had gripped the town. Officials had arrived, proffering a special evacuation train for the children unable to walk to safety, the wards of the state, and the disabled. They guaranteed refuge in a hospital located several counties away. "I was so terrified, David," she had penned. "The water was ascending, and your father was away shoring up the riverbank. They said it was the sole means of saving him. I observed them escort Michael onto that train. I watched the taillights recede into the rain, and then nothing. The train never reached its intended destination. The authorities informed us it had gone astray, that all aboard were lost. I was too frail, too devastated by grief, to challenge them. I accepted the untruth, for hope brought too much pain." A solitary tear finally escaped, tracing a scorching path through the white stubble on David's cheek. He was 75 years old, a man who had witnessed warfare and hardship. Yet, this single document reverted him to a frightened 5-year-old boy once more. His mother had carried this crushing guilt for decades, allowing him to believe his brother had succumbed to illness, shielding him from the grim reality that Michael had simply vanished into the mists of history on a train destined for nowhere. The sound reverberated in his mind again. Clank, drag. the sound of a brother he barely knew walking away from him eternally. The night offered little respite. As the pale, silvery light of dawn began to seep through the draperies, David arose, his joints stiff. He felt an imperative to move, to escape the suffocating weight of the house and its recently unveiled secrets. He dressed by rote in the attire of his retirement, a thick red and navy plaid flannel shirt, softened by countless washes, and over it, a brown leather jacket, worn smooth at the elbows and collar. He donned his boots and proceeded to the rear entrance. Awaiting him, its tail thumping a patient rhythm against the floorboards, was Gunnar, the large German shepherd, his coat the hue of silver shadows and storm clouds, emitted a soft whimper of greeting. Gunnar was David's shadow, his confidant, the only living soul who shared this quiet solitude with him. "Come on, old boy," David murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. "Let's take a walk." They stepped into the sharp chill of late autumn. The air carried the scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, and the harbinger of frost. They traversed the boundary of David's property, where the cultivated lawn yielded to the dense, ancient woods that scaled the West Virginia hills. Typically, this promenade was tranquil, a meditative ritual. Today the woods felt altered. The trees seemed to lean inward, silent witnesses to bygone eras. Every rustle of dry foliage sounded like a hushed murmur. Gunnar ambled ahead, his nose diligently working the breeze, deciphering the forest's narrative like a morning gazette. Abruptly, the dog's demeanor shifted. His ears perked forward, his body tensed, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. A flash of reddish-brown fur darted across their path. A weasel, sleek and swift. Instinct superseded training. Gunnar launched himself in pursuit, a silver streak of muscle and velocity. Quote, "Prue." David called out, but the dog remained singularly focused. The weasel scrambled over a decaying log and vanished into a dark aperture beneath the massive root system of a fallen oak, toppled years prior by a storm. Gunnar, too substantial to follow, thrust his head and shoulders into the hole, frantically excavating with his powerful forepaws, sending soil flying behind him in steady plumes. David hurried over, initially annoyed, yet also grateful for the diversion from his somber contemplations. Quote, 4. The dog disregarded him, whining in frustration, digging with increased vigor, resolute in his determination to apprehend his quarry. He was now halfway beneath the immense trunk, and David feared the unstable earth might collapse upon him. Quote, 5. David grumbled. He knelt amidst the damp leaf litter, nudging the dog's hindquarters aside. Gunnar resisted, emitting a deep-throated bark into the darkness. David reached in, grasping Gunnar's collar to draw him back, but then he perceived what the dog's frantic excavation had revealed. It was not merely roots and soil. Gunnar had cleared away decades of detritus and decomposition to expose something hard and artificial. David leaned closer, squinting in the dim forest light. He discerned wood, but not a tree root. It was a squared timber, blackened by age and moisture, permeated with a substance faintly redolent of ancient creosote. It lay buried deep, extending horizontally beneath the forest floor. David's heart commenced a frantic cadence against his ribs, a sensation entirely divorced from the exertion of their walk. He pushed Gunnar further back and began to excavate with his bare hands, clawing at the sodden earth, oblivious to the cold mud packing beneath his fingernails. He followed the line of the submerged timber, and there, intersecting it perpendicularly, lay cold, unyielding metal. It was thick steel, deeply pitted with a robust orange corrosion, its edge sharp and distinct. David brushed away more soil, revealing the unmistakable profile. It was a railway rail, and the timber beneath it was a sleeper. He sat back on his heels, his breath emerging in short, sharp gasps that dissipated into the frigid air. He surveyed the silent woods. No such tracks were depicted on any contemporary map of this region. These woods had been reclaiming this terrain for 70 years. The letter, resting on his mantelpiece, seared itself into his consciousness. I watched them load Michael onto that train. The sound returned to him then, not as a memory, but as an almost hallucinatory sensation induced by shock, the rhythmic clank-drag of steel leg braces. Here, buried beneath the leaves and the passage of years, lay the iron path that had spirited his brother away. The abstract horror of his mother's confession had just become viscerally, terrifyingly real. Gunnar approached slowly and nudged David's muddy hand with a damp nose, sensing the profound alteration in his master's world. The search for Michael had commenced. The revelation of the buried rail had permeated the very atmosphere around David Thorne. The woods, which he had tread 1,000 times during his retirement years, no longer felt like a sanctuary of tranquility. They now felt like a vault that had been breached, exuding cold, ancient secrets into the November chill. David stood over the small excavation, gazing at the rusted steel edge that Gunnar had exposed. He peered ahead, attempting to discern what the forest had concealed from him. Now that he knew what to seek, the indications were present, subtle yet undeniable. There was an unnatural levelness to the topography here, a corridor where the ancient trees parted slightly, forming a pathway that extended deeper into the wilderness. It was a scar that nature had labored for 70 years to mend, covering the wound with layers of soil, deceased foliage, and tangled brambles. He understood he could not retreat. The letter in his pocket felt weighty, like a stone pressed against his chest. His mother had borne the burden of the truth for an entire lifetime. The least he could do was shoulder the responsibility of the search. David adjusted his collar, shielding himself from the sharp wind. His old brown leather jacket was unzipped, revealing the dark red and navy plaid flannel shirt beneath, offering a layer of warmth against the encroaching chill. He wore faded blue denim jeans, tucked into sturdy work boots, their leather scuffed and worn from years of exertion. He presented as the seasoned veteran he was, a man shaped by hardship and resilience. Yet, his hands trembled slightly as he patted his leg, signaling Gunnar. Quote 1, David said, his voice low. Quote 2, Gunnar, his silver sable coat mirroring the muted tones of the beech tree trunks, fell into stride beside him. The German shepherd seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The light-heartedness of the morning's play had vanished, replaced by a focused, working disposition. His ears rotated like sensitive antennae, detecting the crack of twigs and the rustle of dried leaves from afar. They proceeded, tracing the spectral path of the railway. The terrain presented obstacles. Rhododendrons and mountain laurel had overrun the old passage, their contorted branches reaching out to catch David's jacket. He had to force his way through dense undergrowth, his boots finding purchase on the uneven ground where remnants of rotted wooden ties still lay concealed beneath the surface. As they progressed, David's thoughts returned to 1955. He attempted to visualize the steam engine chugging through these very woods, its smoke billowing into the forest canopy. He envisioned his brother Michael, small and apprehensive, gazing out a window at these same trees. Did Michael realize he wasn't going to a medical facility? Did he feel the train decelerating, halting in the middle of nowhere? The forest grew more formidable, the trees older and more substantial. Daylight began to wane as the afternoon advanced, the sun sinking behind the towering West Virginia mountain ridges. Shadows stretched long and slender, like skeletal fingers pointing the way. After an hour of strenuous trekking, the landscape altered dramatically. The ground dropped steeply on either side, and the trees receded. They had arrived at a profound gorge, a gaping fissure in the earth, where a river tributary thundered far below. Spanning the chasm was a structure that brought David to an abrupt halt. It was a wooden trestle bridge. From David's vantage point, it resembled a scene from a fairy tale, or perhaps a nightmare preserved in time. The bridge extended approximately 50 feet across the gap. Nature had completely reclaimed it. A thick, verdant carpet of emerald moss covered every surface of the decking, making it appear as a solid green velvet pathway suspended in midair. Vines dangled from the railings like draperies, and small saplings had even taken root in the decaying timber. To the casual observer, it appeared enchanting, and crucially, it seemed sturdy. The moss concealed the decay, smoothing over the fissures and cracks. It beckoned passage. David moved closer to the edge. The bridge was the sole route onward. The sides of the gorge were sheer cliffs of slate and limestone. If the train had traversed this path, it had crossed this bridge. And if David intended to discover the train's destination, he too had to cross it. He inhaled deeply, composing himself. He had navigated precarious bridges in Vietnam under enemy fire, constructed from bamboo and sheer will. This was merely wood and moss. He tested his weight on his rear foot, preparing to step onto the verdant expanse. Quote, he commanded, his gaze fixed on the opposite side. David lifted his right boot and began to lower it onto the first beam of the bridge. Suddenly, a low, ominous rumble vibrated through the air. David paused, looking down. Gunnar was not at his side. The dog had positioned himself directly in front of David, planting his feet firmly on the edge of solid ground, his body acting as a physical barrier. Quote, David said, nudging the dog with his shin. Gunnar did not move. The low rumble in his chest intensified, a sound of profound warning that David had rarely heard from the gentle animal. The dog's hackles were raised, a ridge of fur standing erect along his spine. His dark eyes were fixed on David's face, a mixture of pleading and ferocity. Quote 2. David inquired, confusion clouding his judgment. Quote 3. He attempted to step around the dog. Gunnar reacted instantly. He lunged forward not to attack, but to intercept. He clamped his jaws onto the loose denim of David's jeans near the ankle and pulled backward with surprising strength. David stumbled, struggling to maintain his balance. Hey, let go! The dog released the fabric, but immediately positioned himself between David and the bridge once more, barking sharply. It was not a bark of aggression, but a bark of alarm, loud and urgent, echoing off the chasm walls. Gunnar lowered his head and pressed his wet nose forcefully against David's thigh, pushing him away from the edge. David finally ceased his resistance. He looked at the dog, then back at the bridge. Gunnar was a disciplined animal. He never disobeyed a direct order without cause. The veteran glanced at the inviting green path. It appeared so secure, so enduring. But he understood that appearances could be deceptive, and he knew that a dog's senses were attuned to vibrations and scents imperceptible to a human. David surveyed his surroundings and spotted a large rock, roughly the size of a bowling ball, resting near the base of a hemlock tree. He walked over, lifted it with a grunt of exertion, and returned to the ravine's edge. "Okay," David whispered. "Let's see." He hoisted the heavy stone and heaved it in a high arc, aiming for the center of the moss-covered bridge. The rock sailed through the air and landed squarely in the middle of the span. There was no solid thud. There was no resistance. The instant the rock made contact, the illusion shattered. With a sickening, wet, crunching sound, the timber beneath the moss disintegrated. It was as if the wood were made of sodden paper. The rock punched straight through the deck, taking a massive section of the bridge with it. The green carpet tore open, revealing the black, rotted skeleton beneath. A cascade of debris, moss, dirt, and pulverized wood rained down into the gorge. David watched, frozen in horror, as the rock plummeted. He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Far below, a faint splash echoed up from the river. The ensuing silence was absolute. David stared at the gaping hole in the bridge. Had he placed his full weight on that timber, he would have fallen. He would have been consumed by the gorge, shattered on the rocks below. His remains lost as completely as his brother's had been. His legs suddenly felt weak. He took an involuntary step backward, away from the precipice. He looked down at Gunnar. The dog had stopped growling. He sat down calmly, his tail sweeping the dead leaves, looking up at David with an expression of quiet devotion. David dropped to his knees, oblivious to the mud soaking into his jeans. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the silver fur. He could feel the strong, steady beat of the dog's heart against his chest. Quote, David whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Quote, Gunnar leaned into the embrace, licking the side of David's weathered face. David held on for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly subsiding, replaced by a cold clarity. This journey was not merely a walk in the woods. It was perilous. The past did not wish to be disturbed, and the land itself was treacherous. He rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his leather jacket. He gazed across the ravine. The bridge was impassable, but he could discern where the old rails continued on the other side, vanishing into the mist. "We have to find another way across," David stated, his voice steady once more. "We aren't stopping, Gunnar. Not now." He turned from the abyss, his hand resting on Gunnar's head, and together they began to search for a path down into the valley, venturing deeper into the heart of the mystery that had claimed his brother. The drive into town was a quiet affair. David Thorne gripped the steering wheel of his weathered pickup truck, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Beside him in the passenger seat, Gunnar sat upright, his silver sable coat gleaming in the pale morning sunlight, filtering through the windshield. The German shepherd observed the passing scenery with keen intelligence, his head turning slightly to follow the movement of birds on the telephone wires. David felt a cold knot of anxiety in his stomach, unrelated to the winding mountain roads. Following the terrifying incident at the bridge the previous day, the physical reality of the abandoned railroad was undeniable. Now he needed the historical context to match the geography. He required names, dates, and the official explanation for why a train would be dispatched down a defunct line to a location purportedly absent from evacuation logs. He parked the truck on the main street of the small town, the engine sputtering into silence. He turned to Gunnar. "You stay here, partner," David said softly, cracking the window just enough for fresh air, but not for an escape. "I won't be long." Gunnar emitted a low whine in his throat, shifting his weight on the seat, but then settled, resting his chin on his paws, his eyes fixed on David. David stepped out into the crisp November air. He adjusted his brown leather jacket, ensuring it hung open over his favorite red and navy plaid flannel shirt. He smoothed his graying hair and walked toward the brick building housing the county library. The library felt like a place frozen in time, carrying the scent of dust, floor wax, and decaying paper. This was a smell David typically found comforting, but today it smelled of secrets. He walked directly to the front desk where Helen presided. Helen was a woman of indeterminate age, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose, possessing a mind that chronicled local history with greater precision than any computer. "David Thorne," Helen announced, lifting her gaze from her task. "I have not seen you since the memorial service. How are you managing?" "Taking it one day at a time, Helen," David responded, his voice hoarse. "I require your assistance. I am searching for records from 1955, specifically concerning the flood evacuation in a location known as Camp Hope." Helen paused, her forehead creasing. Camp Hope? That antiquated polio ward situated in the valley? That facility has been derelict for 70 years, David. What prompts you to investigate it now? "Simply attending to some unfinished business for my mother," David stated, the falsehood tasting like grit in his mouth. She referenced it in a letter. Helen nodded in understanding and guided him toward the rear of the room where the archives were housed. She retrieved several weighty bound volumes of the local gazette from the shelves and loaded a reel into the microfiche reader. For an hour, the sole sounds in the room were the whirring of the machine and the gentle rustle of turning pages. David perused headlines detailing rising river levels, sandbagging endeavors, and the valiant efforts of the National Guard. Then he discovered it. A small article, tucked away on page 4 of a newspaper dated November 14th, 1955. The headline proclaimed, "Success in the Storm, Orphans Evacuated." David leaned in, his eyes straining to decipher the blurry text. The article reported that, as the dam teetered on the brink of bursting, the county had orchestrated a special transport to evacuate the remaining patients of Camp Hope. It asserted that 12 children, all wards of the state with significant physical impairments, had been successfully conveyed onto a train and transferred to the state mental institution 3 counties away for their safety. The article lauded the prompt actions of the authorities. David leaned back, the plastic chair groaning under his weight. According to this, Michael had been rescued. He had been taken to a hospital. But if that were true, why had his mother written that he was lost? Why did the train tracks lead to a fractured bridge and an impasse? And why had the state mental institution never contacted the families? "Helen," David inquired, maintaining a steady tone, "do we possess any follow-up records? Any admissions logs from the state institution?" Helen shook her head. "Not here, David. Those would be state records, largely sealed for patient privacy." David expressed his gratitude and departed from the library, the copy of the article folded within his pocket. The official account was neat, orderly, and heroic, yet his intuition whispered that it was a fabrication. He returned to the truck. Gunnar immediately sat up, his tail thumping rhythmically against the upholstery. David entered the vehicle but did not ignite the engine. Instead, he retrieved his mobile phone. He paused momentarily before dialing a number he had not contacted in years. "Records Division, Bob speaking." A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Bob, it's David Thorne. A brief silence ensued, followed by a warmer tone. "David, I haven't heard your voice since we fished the Greenbrier. I heard about Martha. I'm so sorry." "Thanks, Bob," David replied. "Listen, I need a favor, a significant one. Do you still have access to the archived admission logs from the 50s? "I shouldn't," Bob chuckled, "but nobody ever changes the passwords on the old servers." "What are you looking for?" "November 1955, David stated, gazing through the windshield at the quiet street. "I need to ascertain if a group of 12 children from Camp Hope were admitted to the state mental institution, specifically a boy named Michael Thorne." "Give me a minute," Bob said. The rhythmic clicking of typing carried over the line. David reached out and rested his hand on Gunner's neck. The dog leaned into his touch. Sensing the palpable tension emanating from his owner, Gunner let out a long exhalation, his warm breath misting the window. "Quote 15. Bob announced, his voice losing its jovial cadence. "Quote 16. Quote 17. David asked, his breath catching in his throat. The silence on the other end stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Quote 18. Bob said slowly, "There's nothing here. No intake from Camp Hope. No record of a Michael Thorne. In fact, the log for that week includes a notation from the administrator, complaining that they prepared a ward for transfers that never arrived." David closed his eyes. "They never arrived." "No," Bob confirmed. "But David, there's something else. I'm looking at the state file for Camp Hope itself. It was officially closed on November 15th, 1955. The listed reason is total evacuation and closure. However, the files for the individual children are marked File Closed, word of the state administrative transfer." "What does that signify?" David demanded. "It's bureaucratic shorthand," Bob explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Back then, word of the state meant nobody was looking for them. No parents with lawyers, no family to ask questions. If a file is marked administrative transfer without a destination, it usually signifies the file was simply closed, erased. It's how they hid mistakes, David, or worse." A chill, unrelated to the external temperature, washed over David. "They falsified the records," he stated flatly. "They claim they moved them to conceal the fact that they never arrived." "It appears that way," Bob said gently. "David, what are you getting yourself into?" "I don't know yet, Bob, but I intend to find out." David ended the call and slowly lowered the phone. The disparate pieces were coalescing into a chilling pattern: the collapsed bridge, the concealed railway line, his mother's confession, and now the falsehood documented in black and white within the state archives. The official narrative maintained the children were saved. The reality revealed that 12 disabled children, his brother among them, had been placed on a train bound for nowhere. They had been disregarded by officials who viewed them not as children, but as liabilities to be expunged from a ledger. A hot, unfamiliar anger surged within David's chest. It was a righteous anger, reminiscent of his days in uniform. They had abandoned Michael. They had consigned him to whatever fate awaited at the end of the dead-end track, and then they had congratulated themselves on a job well done. "They lied, Gunner," David whispered to the dog. "They lied about everything." Gunner looked at him, his amber eyes conveying a profound, soulful understanding. He licked David's hand, a rough, wet gesture of solidarity. David started the truck, the engine roaring to life. He was no longer merely searching for a lost relative. He was investigating a crime scene. He shifted the truck into gear. He needed to return to the woods. He needed to witness where the line concluded. The journey back into the wilderness was arduous. Following the bridge's collapse under the strain of the stone, David and Gunner had been compelled to navigate the steep, perilous slopes of the ravine, crossing the riverbed below. It had consumed hours of sliding down shale banks and scrambling up muddy inclines to regain the elevation of the old railway on the opposite side. By the time they clambered back onto the level ground where the tracks lay concealed, the afternoon light was already fading. The air here felt different, heavier. A dense, clinging mist had descended from the higher peaks, settling into the forest hollows like spilled milk. It muffled sounds and muted the vibrant hues of the autumn leaves to subdued grays and browns. David paused to catch his breath, his hand resting on the rough bark of a hemlock tree. He adjusted his old brown leather jacket, which hung open despite the chill, revealing the red and navy plaid flannel shirt beneath. His faded blue jeans were speckled with mud from the climb, and his sturdy boots felt heavy on his feet. He was 75 years old, and while his tall, lean frame remained strong, the exertion was taking its toll. "You doing okay, buddy?" David asked, looking down. Gunnar shook his coat, sending a spray of water droplets into the damp air. The silver sable German shepherd looked up, his eyes alert but serious. He did not wag his tail. He seemed to sense that they were entering a place that demanded solemnity. They pressed onward. The rail line here was less overgrown than in the earlier sections, possibly because the rocky soil of the high valley supported sparser vegetation. The rusted rails emerged from the earth more frequently, twin iron serpents leading them deeper into the unknown. The topography began to shift. The valley walls narrowed, closing in on them until they were traversing a natural funnel. The trees grew gnarled and ancient, their branches draped with lichen resembling tattered rags. Finally, the tracks ended. They did not terminate at a station or a depot. They simply ceased. The steel rails ran directly into a wall of earth and rock, a box canyon where the mountains rose vertically on three sides, creating a natural cul-de-sac. It was a dead end, a place where the world simply ran out of space. David stopped, his breath clouding in the cold air. The silence was absolute. There was no wind here, no bird song, not even the rustle of squirrels. It was a tomb-like stillness. "Where is it?" David whispered to himself. "Where did they go?" He surveyed the misty clearing. He had anticipated something, a building foundation perhaps, a sign of the camp. But there was nothing but trees and rock. Then Gunnar emitted a low, mournful whine. The dog trotted forward, moving away from the tracks toward the eastern slope of the canyon wall. He halted near a massive mound of debris, a scar on the hillside from a landslide that had occurred decades prior, burying the edge of the clearing under tons of shale and soil. David followed the dog. As he drew nearer, shapes began to emerge from the mist and undergrowth. It was not a natural rock formation. It was man-made, protruding from the edge of the landslide, half submerged in the earth like a discarded plaything, was the skeletal chassis of a railway car. It was not a passenger carriage with glass panes and plush seating. It was a boxcar, a carrier of freight. The wooden sidings were blackened with decay, peeling away in long tatters to expose the iron framework beneath. It lay tilted on its flank, dislodged from the rails by the sheer force of the slide, listing precariously at a 45-degree angle. David approached it with trepidation, a knot of dread tightening in his gut. This was the special transport the newspaper had boasted about. Not a medical train, but a cattle car. He extended a hand and touched the side of the boxcar. The wood felt yielding and frigid. He walked around to the rear, where the heavy sliding doors had been pried open, likely when the car toppled. Gunnar remained at the base of the slope, unwilling to venture closer. He emitted a low, sorrowful whine, his gaze fixed on the dark, cavernous opening of the boxcar's interior. David ascended the pile of debris, his boots skidding on loose scree. He grasped the rusted metal frame of the door and pulled himself up to peer inside. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the feeble gray light that filtered through the fog. The air within reeked of ancient decomposition, sodden earth, and corroded metal. David retrieved a small flashlight from his jacket and activated it. The beam sliced through the murk, playing over the car's contents. He gasped, the sound a sharp, involuntary expulsion of breath. The boxcar was not empty. At the lower end of the angled floor, piled together in a jumbled mass by the combined forces of gravity and elapsed time, were the remnants of an evacuation that never materialized. There were cots, canvas stretchers on wooden frames, now rotted to tatters. There were woolen blankets riddled with moth holes and faded, half buried in the silt that had washed in. But it was the metal objects that arrested David's breath. Entwined amongst the decaying bedding were wheelchairs. They were small, sized for children. David observed the spoked wheels, bent and rusted. He noted the leather seats, stiff and cracked. He counted 3, 4, perhaps 5 visible within the tangled mess. He directed the light further back. There were braces, leg supports crafted from steel and leather, identical to those he recalled his brother wearing. They lay discarded on the floor, hollow shells awaiting limbs that would never again bear weight. The realization struck David with the impact of a physical blow. He clutched the doorframe, his knuckles stark white. There was no engine attached to this car. There never had been. The authorities had not evacuated the children. They had merely moved them out of sight. They had loaded 12 disabled children, the unwanted wards of the state, the ones who impeded the progress of others, into a spare freight car at the terminus of a spur line. They had placed them in a box to await. They were waiting for a locomotive that was likely required elsewhere to transport more significant individuals or valuable materiel. Or perhaps the bridge had succumbed to the floodwaters before the engine could arrive. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. The children had been placed within, instructed to await the train that would convey them to safety. And then they had been abandoned. The landslide must have occurred later, possibly days or weeks after the persistent rains. It had dislodged the car from the tracks, sealing their fate, or perhaps serving as a tombstone for a tragedy that had already unfolded in the frigid chill of November 1955. David directed his light beam onto a small wooden crate near the door. It had been overturned. Spilled from it were tin cups and a few rusted cans. They had been provided with provisions. Merely enough to wait. "They didn't lose you," David whispered, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt hot behind his eyes. "They discarded you." He envisioned his mother weeping for a lost son. He recalled the falsehood in the archives, the neatly placed checkmark beside "evacuated." He gazed at the small wheelchairs jumbled together in the gloom. He pictured Michael sitting in one, huddled beneath a scratchy wool blanket, listening to the rain lash against the roof, watching the door, anticipating the sound of a whistle that would never sound. Tears blurred David's vision. He extinguished the flashlight, unable to bear further observation. The suffocating darkness of the boxcar felt oppressive, laden with the silent cries of the past. He descended the slope, his movements stiff and mechanical. When his boots met the level ground, he collapsed onto his knees amidst the damp leaves. Gunnar immediately came to his side. The large dog neither barked nor whined. He simply pressed his warm, solid bulk against David's flank, offering an anchor in the tempest of his grief. David plunged his hands into the dog's thick, coarse fur, clinging as if the animal were the sole entity preventing him from tumbling off the earth. "I found you, Michael," David choked out into the quiet of the misty valley. "I found you." The wind escalated, moaning through the dead-end canyon, eerily emulating the whistle of a phantom train, arriving 70 years too late. The departure from the boxcar felt akin to leaving a waking nightmare. David turned his back on the decaying wooden tomb, his heart heavy with a sorrow that spanned 7 decades. The mist had intensified, swirling around his ankles like frigid smoke, obscuring the path ahead. Yet, the old rails continued beyond the landslide, guiding them deeper into the valley's cul-de-sac where Camp Hope had once stood. David walked with a resolute pace, though his legs felt unsteady. His worn brown leather jacket hung open, exposing the red and navy plaid flannel shirt beneath to the piercing dampness. But he scarcely registered the chill. The heat of his anger and sorrow sustained him. Gunnar remained close to his left leg, the silver sable German shepherd moving silently, his ears flattened against his head. The dog seemed to comprehend that this was no longer an exploration, but a solemn pilgrimage. A few hundred yards past the boxcar, the trees parted to reveal a wide, level clearing. David halted and stared. He had anticipated desolation, perhaps the skeletal remains of timber frameworks or collapsed roofs. But nature and time had been thorough. The wooden structures of Camp Hope, the dormitories, the mess hall, the administration buildings, had utterly decayed, reclaimed by the damp earth and the ravenous forest. What remained resembled a fortress of phantoms more than a camp. Massive stone foundations emerged from the mist. Constructed from the local river rock and limestone, they were gray and imposing, delineating the perimeters where buildings had once stood. Chimneys fashioned from cut stone stood like solitary sentinels, guarding empty hearths where fires had not blazed since 1955. It was a desolate arrangement of stone rectangles, a floor plan of vanished lives etched into the valley floor. David approached the largest foundation, centrally located in the clearing. This had likely been the main building, housing the medical ward and the kitchens. The stone walls here rose waist-high, thick and robust. "This is it, Gunnar," David murmured, his voice sounding diminutive in the immense quiet. "This is where he lived." He stepped over a low section of the wall, entering the spectral outline of the structure. The ground was carpeted with dead leaves and moss, concealing any remaining floorboards. He walked slowly, endeavoring to conjure the sounds of children, the clatter of dishes, the squeak of wheelchair casters. But the silence was absolute. While David was absorbed by the topography of the past, mentally tracing the layout of the rooms, Gunnar had strayed. The dog had not accompanied David into the primary enclosure. Instead, Gunnar had circled the perimeter, heading towards the rear of the camp, where the clearing bordered a steep rising slope. David paused, realizing he was alone. He turned, scanning the fog. Gunnar? He spotted the dog about 50 yards away, near the forest's edge. Gunnar stood rigid, his nose pointed towards the ground. David sighed and began picking his way over the rubble to retrieve him. As he drew nearer, he discerned what had captivated the dog's attention. Behind the main foundations, the ground undulated in a series of uneven, unnatural shapes. Several oblong mounds of earth rose from the flat forest floor. A light dusting of early frost had settled upon them, making them stand out starkly white against the dark decay of the leaves. Gunnar was pacing anxiously amongst them. He lowered his head and sniffed intently at the base of the nearest mound. A low, keening whine vibrated in his throat, a sound of profound distress. He pawed at the frozen soil, his claws scraping against the dirt, then looked back at David with wide, pleading amber eyes. David approached, but his mind, preoccupied with the image of the boxcar and the search for a basement entrance, struggled to process what the dog was attempting to convey. He saw only piles of earth, perhaps old compost heaps or debris left from the landslide. "Gunnar, leave it!" David commanded, his voice sharp with impatience. "Stop digging." The dog hesitated. He glanced from the mound to David, then back to the mound. He emitted a sharp, frustrated yip, pawing the ground again with increased urgency. "No," David stated firmly. "Come here. We need to find a way down." David turned away, dismissing the dog's behavior as a reaction to a burrowing animal, or perhaps merely the pervasive eeriness of the location. He did not observe Gunnar lingering for a significant moment, gazing at the snow-dusted mounds with a deep, instinctive sorrow, before finally lowering his head and trotting obediently after his master. David returned to the primary foundation. He traced the perimeter of the stone walls, searching for an opening. If the wooden structures were gone, any records or artifacts would have been ravaged by the elements unless protected underground. He was aware that buildings of this era and construction commonly possess deep cellars for the storage of root vegetables and coal. Tucked away on the northern flank of the foundation, concealed by a dense thicket of dormant brambles, was his discovery. A series of concrete steps led down into the ground. At the base, embedded in the stonework of the foundation, lay a formidable iron door. It was extensively corroded, presenting a deep, peeling orange hue, yet it appeared remarkably robust. Its slight incline suggested it was a bulkhead entrance, engineered to withstand harsh weather conditions. David descended the stairs, his footwear skidding on the slippery, moss-covered concrete. He paused before the door, his heart pounding intensely. If answers were to be found, they lay beyond this metal barrier. He extended his hand to the handle, a plain iron ring. Grasping it with both his hands, he pulled. It remained steadfast. The hinges had become fused due to 7 decades of rust and oxidation. David clenched his jaw. Adjusting his footing, he planted his boots firmly. Though advanced in years, a lifetime of manual labor had imbued him with a resilient strength. He seized the handle once more, shifting his weight backward, engaging his shoulders and back. "Come on," he uttered with a grunt. He exerted force until his muscles quivered and the veins on his neck became prominent. For a brief instant, no change occurred. Then, a piercing shriek of metal grinding against metal fractured the prevailing quiet. The bond of rust was broken. With a drawn-out groan of protesting hinges that resembled the lament of a dying creature, the heavy iron door swung outward by a few inches. David inhaled sharply, releasing his grip. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He inserted the tip of his boot into the gap and propelled the door wider. It swung open with substantial weight, revealing a gaping rectangular void of darkness. A surge of air escaped from the opening. It was frigid, colder than the external atmosphere, and it carried an aroma that caused David to pause. It did not emanate the scent of decomposition or rot. Rather, it smelled of arid dust, stone, and time left undisturbed. It was the fragrance of a tomb that had been sealed tightly. David reached into his leather jacket pocket and withdrew a heavy-duty flashlight. He activated it, verifying the illumination. The beam was bright and unwavering. Gunnar stood at the top of the stairs, peering down. The dog whimpered again, his ears twitching. He clearly disliked the location. The scent of the stagnant air appeared to agitate him. "I know, pal," David said gently. "I'm not fond of it either, but we must investigate." David stepped across the threshold. The beam from his flashlight pierced the dimness. He found himself in a spacious expanse. The walls were constructed from the same cut stone as the foundation above, dry and solid. The ceiling was an arched brick structure supporting the immense weight of the environment overhead. It resembled a bunker, a concrete stronghold concealed beneath the earth. The air was utterly still, heavy with the burden of 70 years of tranquility. David advanced a step, his boots creating an echo on the concrete flooring. The light beams swept throughout the chamber. He discerned shapes shrouded in shadow. Shelving units lined the walls. Stacks of crates were visible, and in a corner, rows of metal cots were arranged. Not corroded and dilapidated like those in the train car, but standing in orderly formation. This was more than a simple root cellar. It was a sanctuary. A tremor coursed through David. He had entered the ultimate refuge of Camp Hope. Whatever events had transpired in the concluding days of 1955, the narrative's end was inscribed here within the cold, silent darkness. "Stay close," David whispered to Gunnar, though the dog was already pressed against his leg, seeking reassurance. Man and canine proceeded deeper into the stone fortress, advancing towards the enigmas that had awaited them in the darkness for an entire lifetime. The luminescence from David Thorne's flashlight sliced through the stagnant gloom, illuminating a scene that had been holding its breath for 70 years. He stepped fully into the subterranean stone chamber, his robust boots producing a gritty sound upon the concrete floor. The atmosphere within differed from the damp, earthy aroma of the woods above. It was intensely dry and bitterly cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It carried the scent of aged dust, desiccated pine needles, and the faint, lingering metallic trace of a place that had once been antiseptically maintained. It was a time capsule, hermetically sealed by the rusted iron portal David had just exerted effort to open. David slowly moved the light, showing reverence for the profound silence. The chamber itself was expansive, extending the full length of the foundation above. It had evidently served initially as a repository for root vegetables and coal storage, but during the final days of Camp Hope, it had been repurposed for a different function. Makeshift sleeping quarters lined the walls. These were basic cots, their canvas stretched taut over wooden frameworks, remarkably preserved by the arid, frigid air. Upon each cot lay a woolen blanket, either folded with military precision or rumpled as if the occupant had just departed. In the room's central area stood a substantial cast-iron pot-belly stove, its belly empty of ash, a small quantity of unburnt coal resting in a bucket nearby. David shivered, drawing his worn brown leather jacket more snugly around his torso. The red and navy plaid flannel shirt underneath offered minimal defense against the spectral chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. "It's a shelter," David murmured, his voice absorbed by the pervasive stillness. "They brought them down here to wait out the storm." Gunnar did not appreciate this place. The large silver sable German shepherd remained pressed against David's leg, his body rigid. He emitted a low, resonant whine, his ears swiveling with unease. The dog's olfactory senses were working overtime, twitching as he processed the intricate layers of scent that had been trapped here for decades. David approached the stove. On a nearby table, he observed a collection of tin cups and a few empty cans of peaches. A ladle rested on a tray. It presented a tableau of interrupted existence. Frozen at the moment the last individual had departed, or perhaps at the instant they comprehended they would never leave. While David was examining the cups, Gunnar detached himself from his side. The dog moved towards the far wall of the basement, where the stonework met the natural bedrock of the mountain. Gunnar halted at a particular spot, sniffing intently at a waist-high indentation in the wall, a small alcove that might have once housed a lantern. Gunnar let out a sharp, insistent bark, the sound startlingly loud within the confined area. He scratched at the stone ledge with his front paw, glancing back at David expectantly. "What is it, boy?" David inquired, directing the flashlight beam towards the dog. Gunnar barked once more, nudging a pile of old burlap sacks that had been crammed into the alcove. David walked over, the light playing across the rough stone. Reaching out, he pulled the dusty burlap away. A cloud of ancient dust billowed upwards, eliciting a cough from him. Concealed behind the sacks, pushed deep into the recess as if to shield it from public view, was a metal box. David's heart gave a sudden leap. He recognized the object instantly. It was an olive-drab steel ammunition container, the variation utilized by the military during World War II and the Korean conflict. It was heavy, robust, and constructed to endure catastrophic events. He gripped the folding handle on the top and pulled. The box slid out with a substantial scraping noise. David carried it to the table by the stove and placed it down. He shone the light directly onto the latch. It was not merely closed, it had been sealed. A thick layer of wax, evidently candle wax judging by the irregular drip marks, had been melted over the seams and the latch mechanism. Someone had gone to considerable effort to render this box airtight, ensuring that whatever lay within would withstand moisture, decay, and the relentless march of time. "You wanted someone to find this," David murmured. "You wanted it to wait." He withdrew a pocket knife from his trousers. Using the blade, he meticulously chipped away the hardened wax. It crumbled off in brittle fragments. Once the mechanism was exposed, he lifted the heavy steel latch. The metal groaned, a sound of protest after 70 years of tension. David applied more pressure, his weathered hands trembling subtly. With an abrupt snap, the latch yielded. He lifted the lid. The rubber gasket encircling the rim had performed its function perfectly. The interior of the box was immaculate, carrying a faint aroma of oil and aged paper. Within, nestled atop a folded nurse's cap, was a substantial, leather-bound volume. David picked it up with reverence. It was a ledger, the type used for inventory. However, upon opening the cover, he observed it had been repurposed. The pages were filled with precise, neat, cursive script in blue ink. On the inside cover, inscribed in bold letters, was a name, Claire Vance, head nurse, Camp Hope. David retrieved a wooden chair from the corner, brushed it off, and sat down beneath the beam of his flashlight. Gunnar settled himself at his feet, resting his chin on David's boot, offering a silent tether to the present, while his master drifted into the past. David began to read. The initial entries were routine: quantities of medication, notes on physiotherapy sessions, complaints regarding the heating system. But as David turned towards the latter part of the book, the dates approached November 1955, and the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more hurried. The ink pressed harder against the page. November 12th, 1955. The entry stated, "The rain has not abated for 3 days. The river is rising with unprecedented speed. The bridge is slick, and the road to town is being eroded." Dr. Evans departed this morning in his automobile. He indicated he was going to secure transportation for the children. He took his personal belongings. "I do not anticipate his return." David turned the page, his throat constricting. November 13th, 1955. "The power is out. The generator has flooded. We have relocated the 12 remaining children to the stone basement. It is the only remaining dry location. The dormitories are leaking, and the wind is stripping shingles from the roof. The other staff members, Sarah and Jim, departed on foot an hour ago. They implored me to accompany them. They claimed the dam would not hold, but I observed these children. I looked at Michael and Susan and little Timmy. They are incapable of running. If I leave, who will provide for them? Who will assure them that everything will be all right? I instructed Sarah to depart. I am remaining?" David paused, wiping a tear from his cheek. This woman, this Claire Vance, had undergone the gravest trial of character in this frigid chamber, and had prioritized duty over her own preservation. He continued reading. November 14th, 1955. A train whistle. We detected it. A train had halted on the spur line. A man approached the entrance drenched. He declared, "They are here to evacuate us." He instructed us to place the children in the boxcar. I inquired about the passenger cars. He avoided my gaze. He stated that it was the only option available. We transported them outside in the rain. The boxcar is unsanitary and frigid, but he guaranteed the engine would return within the hour to transport us away. We loaded the wheelchairs. We packed the blankets. David's hands trembled as he advanced to the subsequent page. This marked the moment of betrayal. November 15th, 1955. The engine never materialized. We remained in that boxcar for 6 hours. The temperature plummeted. The rain transformed into snow. A blizzard is engulfing us. The children were succumbing to the cold. I resolved to return them to the basement. It is warmer here. We possess the coal stove. We have sufficient canned peaches and beans for 2 days. I attempted to reach the junction, but the snow is waist deep, and the bridge appears precarious. We are stranded. The script in the final entries began to waver, becoming irregular and faint, as though penned by a hand numb by the cold. November 16th, 1955. It is profoundly silent. The snow has obscured the windows. We are a submersible vessel beneath the white abyss. The coal supply is dwindling. I am utilizing the dormitory furniture to fuel the stove. The children are apprehensive. I recount narratives to them. I inform them that the train is merely stalled in the snow and will arrive imminently. And then David spotted his brother's name. Michael is a courageous spirit. He is in distress. The dampness aggravates his legs, yet he never voices a complaint. He sits by the stove and sings. He possesses a beautiful, clear voice. He sings, "You are my sunshine," to the younger ones when they weep. He informed me today that he is unafraid because his brother David will one day be a soldier, and soldiers invariably arrive to rescue people. He gave me his toy soldier for good luck. David emitted a ragged sob that reverberated off the stone walls. He stooped, pressing his forehead against the cool leather of the diary. The image of his brother, 7 years old, freezing in the darkness, singing to comfort the other children, believing that David would save him, shattered something profound within him. He had failed to save him. He had matured, gone to war, lived a complete life, all while Michael waited in the darkness. Gunnar rose and rested his front paws on David's knees, licking the tears that streamed down the old man's face. David buried his hands in the dog's fur, clinging on with all his might. He compelled himself to read the concluding entry. It was dated November 18th, 1955. The coal has been exhausted. The wood is too saturated to ignite. The cold has infiltrated our sanctuary. The children are in a profound slumber. It is the sleep of hypothermia. I understand what is imminent. I have secured the medical records and this diary within the ammunitioned box Dr. Evans left behind. I will seal it with wax from our final candle. Should anyone discover this, know that we did not desert them. We were abandoned. I am going to recline with them now. I will hold Michael's hand. We shall not be alone in the darkness. The diary concluded at that point. David gently closed the book. The silence in the basement was no longer vacant. It was imbued with the presence of Claire Vance and the 12 children she had refused to abandon. She had preserved the truth within this container, awaiting 70 years for someone to arrive and bear witness to it. David arose, his legs stiff. He returned the diary to the box, alongside the other items he had uncovered. A few medical files, and a small tin toy soldier. "I heard you, Claire," David whispered into the frigid air. "I heard you." He glanced at Gunnar. The dog was observing him with gentle, compassionate eyes. "We must complete this, Gunnar," David stated, his voice hardening with renewed determination. "We possess the truth now. We are not merely seeking a grave. We are locating a crime scene." He lifted the heavy steel box. It represented the evidence of a sacrifice and a betrayal that the world had forgotten. He would ensure it was not forgotten any longer. With the box tucked under his arm and Gunnar leading the way, David ascended the concrete stairs, emerging from the tomb of the past into the cold light of the present day. David sat in the stillness of the stone basement, the beam of his flashlight fixed upon the diary's open pages. The air was frigid, settling into the creases of his worn brown leather jacket and seeping through the red and navy plaid flannel shirt beneath. Yet David perceived none of it. His entire world had contracted to the blue ink on the aged paper. He reread the entry, his lips moving silently as he traced the words penned by Nurse Claire Vance nearly 70 years prior. November the 16th, 1955. The entry stated, "The darkness is absolute now. The lantern oil is depleted, but Michael is a brave soul. He sits by the cold stove in the dark, and he sings. He possesses a beautiful, clear voice that seems too large for his small chest. He sings, 'You are my sunshine,' to the younger ones when they cry. He informed me today that he is not afraid because his brother David will one day become a soldier, and soldiers always arrive to rescue people. David squeezed his eyes shut, battling the stinging sensation of tears. He could almost hear it. He could envision the hollow acoustics of this stone chamber, amplifying the thin, wavering voice of a 7-year-old boy singing of sunshine in a place where the sun would never dawn again. Michael had not been fearful. He had been waiting. He had spent his final moments imparting comfort to others, clinging to a belief in his younger brother that David felt he had done nothing to merit. David slowly closed the heavy leather cover of the diary. He placed it gently back into the steel ammunition box, handling it as if it were a sacred artifact. He needed to stand. The emotional burden of the words was crushing him, and he felt an urgent need to move, to act, to find some physical connection to the brother who had died believing in him. He rose from the wooden chair, his knees cracking audibly in the cold. He picked up the flashlight and swept its beam across the room. The basement resembled a grim dormitory for the forgotten. The rows of canvas cots stood in silent formation, now empty. The wool blankets folded or draped exactly as they had been left. David walked slowly down the line, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. He passed a cot with a small rag doll resting on the pillow. He passed another with a pair of small, round spectacles folded on the blanket. Then, in the far corner of the room, set apart slightly from the others, as if to allow for extra space, he saw it. It was a small cot identical to the others, but resting on the gray wool blanket was a shape that made David's breath hitch. Metal. Cold, hard, unforgiving metal. David moved closer, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. Lying on the bed were leg braces. They were archaic contraptions by contemporary standards, constructed from heavy steel rods and stiff, thick leather straps. The leather was cracked and dry, darkened by age and perspiration. The steel sidebars were pitted with rust, transforming into a deep reddish brown. At the base were the heavy orthopedic shoes, their leather soles worn unevenly. David reached out, his hand hovering above them. These were the cages that had confined his brother's legs. These were the anchors that had tethered Michael to the earth while David ran free. He set the flashlight down on the mattress so the beam illuminated the braces. With both hands, he reached out and grasped the cold steel. They were heavier than he had anticipated, considerably heavier. He lifted them from the cot, the weight tugging at his arms. How had a 7-year-old boy managed to move this weight every single day? How much strength had it required simply to walk across a room? As he lifted them, the hinge joints at the knees, loose with age and lack of oil, swung freely. The steel rods collided with each other. Click, clack. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and unmistakably metallic. It echoed off the stone walls of the basement, a harsh percussion in the silence. Click, clack. David froze. The sound bypassed his ears and struck him directly in the center of his chest. It was a key turning in a lock he had kept sealed for 70 years. Suddenly, the cold stone basement vanished. The darkness dissolved into the bright, blinding white of a summer sun. David was 5 years old again. The year was 1955, months before the inundations. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and hot asphalt. He stood on the sidewalk outside their modest house, his sneakers tightly laced, his legs bouncing with boundless energy. "Wait up, Davy!" The voice was high-pitched and breathless behind him. David did not wait. He took off running, the wind in his hair, the sheer exhilaration of movement propelling him forward. He was racing toward the creek, toward the large oak tree, toward adventure. Behind him, he heard the sound. Click, clack, drag, click, clack, drag. It was the sound of exertion, the sound of struggle. "Davy, please wait for me." David turned his head, glancing back over his shoulder. He saw Michael, his face flushed red with effort, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead. Michael was swinging his legs forward, the heavy steel braces glinting in the sun. He was striving with all his might to keep pace, his knuckles white as he gripped his crutches. But David did not stop. He was young, and the impatience of youth was a cruel burden. He did not wish to decelerate. He did not wish to walk at the rhythm of the click-clack. "Catch me if you can!" David yelled, laughing, and he turned his back on his brother. He sprinted away, leaving the sound of the braces behind him, fading into the distance until the struggle was no longer audible. The recollection struck the 75-year-old David with the impact of a physical blow. He found himself in the frigid basement, struggling for breath. The spectral warmth of that summer day had been supplanted by a chill seemingly originating from his very core. He had fled. He had abandoned him. And months later, when uniformed men escorted Michael to the train, David had remained beside his mother's leg, observing. He hadn't pursued the vehicle. He hadn't attempted to board the train. He had allowed Michael to disappear into the darkness, just as he had let him fall behind on the pavement. Quote, David croaked, his voice failing into a raw sob. Quote, 2. His knees buckled. The resilience that had sustained him through wars and adversity deserted him entirely. David collapsed onto the concrete floor, embracing the rusted leg braces as if they were the most treasured possessions imaginable. He drew himself around them, huddling on the cold floor of the tomb where his brother had perished. Then the tears arrived, hot and swift, dissolving the stoic facade of the veteran. He wept for the 5-year-old boy who knew no better, and for the 75-year-old man who had arrived too late. He wept for the song sung in the darkness and for the subsequent silence. He swayed back and forth, pressing the cold metal against his flannel shirt, the rhythmic clicking of the loose joints whispering his failures with each movement. Suddenly, he felt a warmth against his side. Gunnar, who had been keeping watch near the entrance, approached with concerned eyes. Perceiving his master's distress, the large silver sable dog moved closer. He made no sound, neither bark nor whine. He simply came to David's side and pressed his solid, muscular body against the man's trembling frame. Gunnar lowered his substantial, blocky head, resting it firmly on David's lap, directly upon the rusted braces. The dog emitted a long, deep sigh, his warm breath a counterpoint to the cold air. He remained utterly still, offering his weight and warmth as an anchor. He was a grounding presence, a tangible reminder that David was not alone in the gloom. David buried his face in the dog's thick fur. He detected the aroma of earth and canine, a stark contrast to the sterile dust of the basement. He sobbed into the animal's coat, his fingers becoming entangled in the silver strands, clinging as waves of grief washed over him. Gunnar bore the burden without protest. He gave David's hand a single lick, a coarse, sandpaper sensation, then settled back down, his amber eyes alert in the dim light, guarding his master as he fractured and, slowly, agonizingly, began to mend. Dawn broke over the mist-laden valley with a deceptive calm. The sun struggled to penetrate the dense fog obscuring the treetops, casting a faint, diffused illumination upon the stone remnants of Camp Hope. David Thorne sat on the tailgate of his truck, which he had parked near the overgrown trailhead the previous evening. He had been unable to depart. After discovering the diary and the braces, the notion of driving away and leaving Michael in the darkness once more felt like a betrayal he could not endure. Consequently, he and Gunnar maintained a vigil, their sleep restless in the cab, guarding the specters of 1955. David held a steaming metal mug of coffee, his hands clasped tightly around it for warmth. He wore his well-worn brown leather jacket unzipped, revealing the red and navy plaid flannel shirt beneath. His faded blue jeans were stiff from the cold dampness of the mountain air, and his sturdy work boots were still caked with mud from the excavation. Gunnar sat at his feet, the silver sable German shepherd, watchful and attentive. The dog's ears swiveled toward the valley entrance, twitching at a sound too faint for David's aging hearing to discern. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It commenced as a tremor in the soles of David's boots, a subtle shudder that disturbed the surface of his coffee. Next came the sound. It was not the gentle whisper of wind or the cry of a hawk. It was a low, guttural, mechanical rumble, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. Birds suddenly erupted from the canopy above, a frantic scattering of wings fleeing the disturbance. David stood, placing his mug on the truck bed. "What is that?" Gunnar responded with a low, rumbling warning in his chest, his hackles rising along his spine. The growl resolved into distinct noises, the heavy, grinding clatter of metal tracks on stone, the high-pitched whine of hydraulics, the roar of diesel engines straining under a significant load. David grasped his walking stick and signaled to Gunnar. They moved swiftly down the trail toward the clearing where the stone foundations lay. The mist swirled around them, agitated by the intrusion. Upon reaching the edge of the tree line, David halted, pulling Gunner back into the concealment of a dense rhododendron bush. The sanctuary had been breached. A colossal yellow excavator was tearing through the undergrowth, its steel treads gouging the delicate forest floor. Following close behind, a bulldozer advanced, its blade raised like a shield. Several pickup trucks bearing the Summit Ridge Developments logo on their doors bounced along the rough path carved by the heavy machinery. The acrid scent of unburnt diesel fuel and exhaust permeated the air, overwhelming the fragrance of pine and damp earth. It was the odor of destruction. The convoy came to a standstill directly in the center of the clearing, adjacent to the main stone foundation, where David had discovered the basement entrance. A man emerged from the lead pickup truck. He appeared ill-suited to the wilderness. He wore a pristine white hard hat, a high-visibility vest over a clean jacket, and carried a large roll of blueprints. This was Rick, the project manager. David had encountered his ilk before, individuals who viewed a mountain and perceived only lumber quantities or potential condo square footage. Rick approached the foreman of the excavator crew, shouting to be heard above the idling engines. David crept closer, moving silently through the undergrowth, grateful for the muffling noise of the machinery. Gunner paralleled his movements, his belly low to the ground, his gaze fixed on the intruders. "We're behind schedule," Rick bellowed, unfurling the blueprints on the hood of his truck. He pointed a finger at the stone ruins. "This all needs to be cleared by Tuesday. The investors are coming for a site walk on Friday, and I want this looking like a build-ready lot, not a haunted house." The foreman, a burly man with grease smudged on his face, gestured toward the stone foundations. "These walls are thick, Rick. Local limestone. It'll take some time to break them down, and there's a basement level. We might have to fill it in." "I don't care what it takes," Rick snapped. "Bring in the breaker attachment. Crush it all. Fill the hole with the debris. Just make it flat. We're putting the guest parking lot right here. The lodge goes up on the ridge." A cold fury coursed through David's veins. A parking lot. They intended to transform Camp Hope's final resting place, the site where Claire Vance had sacrificed everything, into an asphalt expanse for tourists to park their SUVs. Rick turned and gestured toward the rear of the clearing, directly at the snow-dusted mounds that Gunner had discovered the previous day. "And those piles over there," Rick said, waving his hand dismissively. "Level those out first. Looks like old spoil piles from a landslide. Just push them over the edge of the ravine. I want a clean line of sight to the valley." David's breath caught. Spoil piles. Rick was unaware. He saw only dirt and rocks to be moved. He didn't perceive their shape. He didn't know that beneath that frozen earth lay the remains of children who had awaited discovery for 70 years. "You got it, boss," the foreman replied,